documentation is one of the most frustrating areas of open source software. GitHub recently did an open source survey, and documentation and being incomplete and confusing was way above everything else. And so if we can improve that, if we can improve the documentation and we can improve the lives of the open source users, everyone will have a better experience, be more successful, and the actual open source projects will have a huge impact as a result. And so that is what I'd like to talk about today. So for those who haven't met me before, my name is Ben Hall. I'm based in London, and I was the creator of a platform called Katacoda, which was acquired by O'Reilly Media in November 2019. And O'Reilly do all of the amazing books with animals on the front cover. So it's a great company to be part of and help improve the developer learning experience. And those who never saw Katacoda before, it was this great interactive browser-based experience where you can try Docker, Kubernetes, all of these technologies without having to download, install, or set everything up. You just go to katacoda.com and you would instantly have a full VM directly in your browser where you could play, explore, kill the machine, hit refresh, and you would be back to a nice, shiny, clean experience. And during our time, we spent a lot of time working with different open source projects and different companies. So we worked a lot with Red Hat and CNCF. You may have saw it on kubernetes.io if you ever went there. We power their interactive tutorials. So we learned a lot about documentation, user experience, what works, how developers learn, and that is kind of what's been driven into this talk. So I'm going to walk through the three main points about what I think are important. I'm going to start with the open source experience and that user's journey about how they come across open source projects and what they're experiencing, and then walk through how we can make sure that our documentation is supporting those requirements. And then give some examples, some inspiration, look at what's working well in the industry and what could be improved. And we have to remember that when users come across an open source project, it's literally a fire hose of information. There's new technologies, new terminologies, new patterns, new practices. Everything is just this flood of information. And so when we think of our users and we think of what they're going through at that time, it's quite daunting. Like, you'll go to many talks today and tomorrow and on Friday, and there'll be all of these exciting new projects you want to play with. But when you get started, it's like, wow, okay, so I need to know all of these different things, get all of this information set up. And if the documentation isn't there, it can be a daunting experience. And that's what we want to catch before it gets too late. And if we have it structured right, our documentation can really support this flow of users and generate potential new users too. Our potential users become implementers. They'll implement that project in their industry or in their project. That will highlight potential improvements that need to be made, potential gaps in documentation, potential bug fixes or issues that get risen. And hopefully they'll become contributors. Hopefully they will submit that pull request so that they will improve the project. And then once they have that little bit of connection and they've gone through it once, they'll start to want to do more. And then they'll become full-fledged maintainers. And more maintainers you have an open source project, the more users you're going to get, the more feature complete, the more rich. And that will start a spin cycle of gaining more implementers, more contributors, and become more successful than everything else. Or at least that is our aim. So to help me on explain this user's journey, I'd like to introduce you to Janet. Janet from The Good Place. Everyone needs a Janet in their life. And Janet is, at the moment, a potential new user. She has joined the project and very excited, lots of new ideas, lots of new concepts, and they are excited to get going. But now we introduce our first problem with documentation. And that is that, in reality, no one ever reads documentation. No one really wants to write the documentation, but everyone wants documentation. And this is the fundamental flaw we have with the art of documentation. So how does this actually work in reality? So when I say no one reads, obviously we do read, but we don't read everything completely. We like skim across, especially in an online laptop-based experience. We're kind of skimming for keywords, key aspects. And so these are some heat maps from some research that I found, where it kind of shows where our eyes are focused. And at the top, we're very engaged, and then we kind of drift off, which is, as you'd expect, is a corporate website about us page. But that's the same when you look at results pages and everything. We're very engaged at the beginning, and then we start to kind of like, this isn't really for us, and we'll move on. And so that's why when you're kind of Googling around, you'll quickly look at the few results, go, no, that's not for me, type something else. You won't really go ever on to page 5, because whoever gets to page 5 on Google. And the other side is if we write too much, we end up with these walls and blocks of information. And like these formal kind of white papers are just so dense, so intense to read that you're going to have to spend all day going through and kind of finding the key bits of information. And so if all of our documentation is in this format, we're not going to get very far. Users are going to look at it and go like, not for me, and just go to the next GitHub project down the road. And this is the problem, like reading these large blocks of text is just painful. Like we come across it, and me especially just sees that wall and goes like, that is a wall which I'm not willing to climb, and I will just walk away. But even more, it's painful to write. Like writing that much information, writing that kind of going in depth, very dense information takes a long time. Takes a long time to edit, takes a long time to update, keep maintained. And so we want to slowly move away, not even start, to write those kind of experiences. And then we got to look about why does that happen? Like, why is a block of text so difficult to read? And it gets into the patterns where we have about reading and absorbing information. So this is one called the commitment pattern. And this is where you will read every single word on every single page and try and absorb everything. And this is where it's very difficult to do and very unlikely to actually happen in real life. You're not going to read every single word. That's just not how the human brain works. And I'll show you some examples later on. And so if we're writing our documentation with this in mind, the reality is people aren't going to absorb it. So we want to make sure that we're not investing in this type of documentation, which isn't going to have the full payoff and the full impact. One which I'm much more likely to do when I'm trying to debug issues is just scan for headlines. Scan for these keywords about, okay, I know that I need to be able to set it up or need to be able to install it. So I'm looking for those key headers to help me navigate quickly to that section which I care about. And so again, we want to make sure that when we're thinking about our formats and our layouts, that these headers are very clear, very explicit to help people who are using this layer cake pattern of scanning to be able to quickly get to where they need to go. And once you're in that section, you start to get into the spotter pattern. You're looking for certain kind of elements which relate to what you think you need. So if you're looking for installation, you're looking for that quick command that you can just copy and paste. Like you want that to be very clear, very explicit. Or that quick kind of like error message that you've come across and you're trying to find it. So that's what you're looking for. And you'll kind of forget everything else around it until you get to that point. So now when you're actually in that mind, it's interesting how the human body starts to adapt. And this is a great example where I'm saying like these blocks of text isn't where we want to be, because that's not how the human brain is adapted to read, or at least not in the English example I'm using here. Where like this kind of makes sense. It doesn't at all, but you can kind of get enough there. Likewise, if there's mistakes, your brain will adapt and kind of like overlook it. I'm not sure how this works in other languages. I should have looked it up, but in this. And so in this case, multiple times, just like, oh yeah, you just don't see it. It helps because it's on a different line break and, you know, every trick works. But yeah, it just looks normal. Which is why proofreading your own work is almost impossible, because you'll just read what you wanted to put in the first place and you'll skip these things. So there's tools out there to help you. So I like Grammarly. Grammarly is like a Chrome extension or various other extensions that you can have. It's its own text editor, and it will help catch common mistakes. So things like you and your and you are, things like the and the, it would say these are repeated. It will offer better suggestions where your sentence is too complicated or too long. And it will just help catch these odd spelling mistakes that we overlook. So when you're writing lots of documentation, this is a great thing just to have in the background, just to catch any common errors that you may be coming across. And so what we want to be doing is we need to be thinking about our target audience. We need to be remembering Janet, thinking about what is Janet going through at this point in time. And so when Janet first comes across a project, we need to be thinking like, there's two key things to keep in mind for that very first user experience. So does this solve my problem? Like, is this project even relevant to what I'm trying to achieve? Especially when we have some weird and wonderful open source project names. They're not the most descriptive in the world. So being able to help users navigate to actually a very clear definition of what it's doing will really help the situation. And then other motivation is, will it actually help my career? Like, is this a long-term project kind of fundamental change within the industry that while it's not relevant for me today, it will potentially be relevant for me going forward and long term. So you can think of things like Kubernetes from a few years ago. Like when that trend happened, no one was deploying Kubernetes into production, but it was a tool that you knew is going to be fundamental to the industry going forward. And you want to see like, okay, I need to be able to learn at least enough to be confident that when that problem does arise, I know Kubernetes is the tool or isn't the tool for me. Same with things like WebAssembly now. Like, is WebAssembly relevant? Where is it relevant? What is going to be the future of that? Being able to jump in and quickly identify that early on in documentation is super important for users. And this is where the README aspect comes in. Because when you navigate and you go to that GitHub repo, because that is now generally the central way people are approaching things, this is the signpost. This is where you are directing people about what are important. And this is where good READMEs can make such a huge difference because they have nice clear headings, they have nice clear signposts and examples about where to go, where to find out more information, what the project's purpose is, how to get started, and some other things which we'll look at on the way. But this is also where you can really put off users and just make it so daunting that they don't want to try. Things like download a 10 gigabyte VM. Like, if I see that as my installation pattern, it's like, you know what, this is probably too much effort for what I want to achieve. This is not the open source project for me. Other things like saying, just use CloudFormation to deploy. Like, just use CloudFormation is fine if you already have an AWS account, if you already know how CloudFormation works, if you already are confident in those technologies. If you're not, then you want to use this open source project, you now have to sign up to a new cloud provider, you have to learn a new technology just to figure out whether that open source project is right for you and whether it's actually going to solve the problems which you want it to do. So we need to think about how we can, not spill water on my laptop, how we can take a user's ambition and motivation and be able to showcase that in a way that it doesn't require a huge amount of effort up front. And so that people can see the value, see the purpose, get motivated, and then want to continue on that journey when it gets a little bit more difficult. So good examples are things like GIFs and short videos, like ASCII Cinema, are great ways. So this is Cosnet, which was a Kubernetes tool from way back, and this was a live interactive and experience. So you could take the examples on the left, and then that would automatically be translated and you'd see the output on the right. And so you could play, you could experiment, you could explore without having to do anything, directly there on the homepage. And that will kind of give you an indication about, okay, I now understand the purpose, I understand the goal, it feels right for me, so I'm much more likely to go ahead and proceed into the next stages of what that project requires. The work we did with Kubernetes with Katacoda was a very similar aspect. We gave you that Kubernetes cluster in your browser, so we skipped all the effort about, okay, I need to set up a VM, I need to learn how to install it, I need to know how to make sure it's started, and etc. We removed all of that initial upfront pain and got people to the value straight away. And then they could see that value, they could experience it, they could go through and launch a few clusters, run a few apps and go like, yes, I get Kubernetes, I see the value, and now I'm willing to go through all of that initial upfront pain about getting it set up, getting it installed, because I've already seen the payoff and I know where that value lies. Or alternatives like, I see Kubernetes value, that's me, that's done, I'm happy, I will go back and I'll look at this another day when it's relevant for me. And different aspects and different services do this in different ways. So Stripe do one of the most amazing documentation there is on the internet, Stripe being the payment processing company. But within their documentation, they have really nice workflows which will support a user as they're going through and learning about how to implement that solution. So in this case, we've got a few lines of code to demonstrate how to create the card element and then how to get that into process. So they see, it's not too difficult, and then they see the payoff at the same time. And then as they walk people through, they start to demonstrate the more kind of complex aspects, but also in an accessible way. So a simple kill command to help people, like, if you make an API request, this is what's going to happen as a result. And this gets improved later on in other examples, but it's a nice way to walk people through that step-by-step process, break it down into accessible chunks, and make it something which they can experience. So I could copy this locally, I could edit and tweak the settings and actually start to piece all of these moving parts together, build my confidence, build my understanding, and become much more successful with the platform. And at the end, the important part is like, okay, you've gone through, you've seen the value, you've seen the examples, so where do you go next? Like, what are your next pointers? What do you want to be encouraging people to do after that initial great first experience? So in this case, like, you probably want to be charging people, you want to be creating a subscription. Those are the most common use cases in Stripe. So help people know where to go next. And this is all about empowering people. Like, we want our documentation to be able to support and assist people with what their efforts are. So help them build confidence. Things like what Stripe were doing, where they could have that curl command, have people run it, is about building confidence, about making people understand it is accessible, it is achievable, it is something which they can easily do with that service. And once they have that confidence, they have that trust. It's like, yes, I know that Stripe is there to support me, or that Kubernetes will be there to help. And this is both for open source and commercial projects, but it gives you a huge advantage over every other open source project. Like, we want our things to be successful. And so if we can help people have confidence in what we're delivering and trust that we'll be there to catch them when the problems do arise, then they'll have the advantage to continue going forward and make sure that everything is going to be successful. And so our examples and helping people get started are extremely important. And we need to be aware where people are in this journey. So this is quite a nice, simple example. Just some Golang code. It's got some API calls. It's doing some, and it will print a response. Like, okay, fine. But we need to be careful about assuming prior knowledge. Because I look at that, I'm like, okay, fine. It's Go. I'm not a huge Go expert. So if I try to run it, it will just all fail completely because it's not actually valid Go code. It doesn't have all of the right includes and the imports, doesn't have all of the functions. So if I just copied and pasted that, it would fail with an error message, and that would harm that whole building confidence and building trust at the very first hurdle, because then you would have to start debugging a getting started example. So that's not where you want people to be in step one. Where you look at other examples, they are much more feature complete, and it kind of is designed to catch that before it even starts. So this is an example of the Google API. And so it's telling you you're going to need to run some steps beforehand. Very nice, very explicit at the beginning, so that people know how to catch that. And then they have full, complete working examples of the code. So it's not just snippets, it's not just prior examples, it's something which people can copy and paste and get running straight away. And even a better bit about, because Google can do this, is they have their multi-language support. So you flip between one, it flips all of them in the example. And so again, it's telling you, you know what, you need to go run go-get at the time to be able to install it. Otherwise, you're not going to have a great experience. So while you may be working on a Go project, it doesn't assume that you're a Go expert, which is important because not everyone can be an expert in everything. And so when we go through and look at others, making it so that you catch users before they make potential mistakes is going to be a great experience for users. And I love what Spotify did with their documentation. So it's got OAuth integration. So as part of the documentation workflow, it asks you to log into your Spotify account. And then all of the examples throughout the documentation is updated with your token. And so it's now attached to your account, to the code which you're actually going to be working on. And so you can copy the snippets and have them working as it will be in reality. And so now we don't have random errors. We don't try and run a code which has got a insert your project key here. and you have to go back and kind of update it, you're much more likely to get a great experience straight off the back by using this kind of pattern and workflow. Takes some effort, but the payoff and the reward is justified. So then we get into the other issue about language. Like, not everyone is English native speaker. And so this can be a blocker, particularly when you're trying to use certain words or kind of certain terminology, but also inclusivity. Like, we want to make sure that our documentation is accessible to everyone as possible. So keywords like just, easy, simple. Like, you may think it's easy to copy that Go code and run it, but in reality, if you're not someone who's spent the last 5 years working on that open source project, it's probably not as simple as easy. And also making sure that we're using inclusive terminology. So now we have some great frameworks around us. So alexjs.com will actually help catch these types of terminology within your documentation and help you improve it. So this is a Vim editor integration that they have. So it will say like things like, we shouldn't be using master. Like, master is a term as an industry we said move away from, and it's giving you suggestions about what else we could potentially be using to be a more open, inclusive documentation. And we can also include this in some automation. So it's a plugin for Vim, VS Code, etc. So great as we're writing, but also great as part of a CI/CD system where you can put it in, include it in your pipeline, scan over all of your documentation every single time a change is made, and then flag up warnings as you need to. And with GitHub Actions, we can automate that. So every pull request that gets made into the documentation, every pull request that gets made into the documentation, you can run this check over it and just make sure that we're capturing potential mistakes early on in the process, getting them fixed, and so that we don't have a lasting impact on the quality of the documentation we're producing. So once we've done all of this, hopefully Janet is now in a great place. Right, Janet has seen our open source project. She's tried a few examples which work straight out the gate. She understands the goal, she understands the direction of the project, and she's in love. So it solves all of her problems, which is step one. Like, we want to get people engaged and moved on. But now we're facing like a different dimension. We're facing a different aspect of what the documentation needs are. And that's where it starts to get into like the next stage and the next maturity about what we want the users to be able to do. And it's like, step one, what else can this project do? Like, how far does the scope continue? What other problems do I have that it may be able to solve, which I haven't thought about yet? Or, most likely, I've broken something, now what do I do? So, when it comes to what's possible, like, this is a great time to start helping users explore the fundamentals, like explore and help them think outside of the box so that they can start to connect dots, which you may have as a maintainer and as a contributor or the creator of this project, be that internal or external. But as a new user, you wouldn't necessarily have that same pattern of thought. So you want to make sure that that's explicit and make sure that people know some of the ideas that you had in the first place. And this is where you can assume prior knowledge so that you can build on those examples that went before and accelerate them. So DigitalOcean are fundamentally amazing at their documentation and their support around community, making sure that while it is a cloud platform, it's helping people use their platform in reality, in interesting ways that they may not have thought about yet. It's not their community section is not just about start a VM, start a load balancer, and then it's like, I'm done. Like, it's all up to you now. They're taking people along that journey about how do you be successful with their product, but also building on top of their product to solve the real world problems that they have. So examples about using their command line, but also like, okay, maybe you need to think about configuration management. Maybe you want to look at Prometheus and metrics and dashboards. All of the things that may be fundamental to someone's journey, but when they're at the beginning, they're not thinking about yet. And so we can start to highlight that. Others is Twilio, which I really like. Nice, straightforward, where it's saying, I code in drop down and I would like to know about product. This is cool because now I can say I'm a Node.js developer and I want to learn about sending text messages, or I want to learn about making phone calls, or I want to learn about all of the other amazing things that the API can do, which I may not even be aware of. So by having it in this drop-down, I'm being shown the potential without even being aware of it. And then once you do drop into an example, and once you do drop into one of the actual areas of the page, it's, again, very much example-driven, interactive, and highlighting what's important. So you're getting nice, clear code snippets. You're getting a nice, clear structure about what's important, where that user is heading. And it can really make a difference when you're navigating around and exploring what's possible. So that helps people explore and see what else is available. But more commonly, it's going to be, okay, I've done something, it's not working right, what's wrong? And this is where we have to remember, again, that users' emotions and where they are. At this time, you always have to go back to Douglas Adams and Hitchhikers, and you want a big book with, on the cover, it says, "Don't panic." Because a user at this point is probably going to be panicking. It could be broken in development, but it also could be broken in production, at which point you are potentially having downtime. You potentially have managers and bosses and other people constantly asking for an update about when is it going to be back? When is it going to be live? When is it going to be up? And so the user at this point is probably extremely stressed. They're frustrated because it's broken. They're stressed because they wanted to have something else done. And they just want to know what the answer is. And apparently it's 42. So where do users go? So we go Stack Overflow. You type into Google the error message, and you generally end up in Stack Overflow or GitHub issues. The best is when you open GitHub issues and it's an issue you raised 3 years ago and it's still not been answered. So these will really help and highlight your frustration levels. But this is where you need to think about your documentation workflow and not just your world within the docs, but also how your users are approaching this. How are users discovering and finding information about your project? Because that is going to have a direct impact. There's huge amounts of questions on Stack Overflow, and that's where everyone's going when they have that problem, but there's no answers, there's no information, it's not very clear. That's going to reflect directly on the documentation of the project, regardless of if you created it or not. Where the best projects I've seen embrace Stack Overflow. They will say, like, yes, this is the problem, and here's a link to our documentation that we maintain, we update, and we'll keep it fresh, so that if for the next 1,000 people coming across this post, they know exactly where to go. And this will help help restore that level of normality, and rebuild that confidence and trust, or continue to build that confidence and trust, because they know that the team are actively paying attention and supporting it. But if people are facing errors, it would be amazing if we wouldn't have to write any documentation to support that at all. Like, errors will exist. It will be a natural part of the process. But if we don't have to write documentation, that's win-win for everyone involved. And so languages are starting to do this within their implementation. And so instead of the days of it just being a random compiler error without any support, without any information that you would have to go look up on Stack Overflow or somewhere else, we now have it where the language is like, you don't need NAP. You may want to NAP, but that is not particularly what you need at the moment. You want MAP or any of these other implementation possibilities. And likewise, this structure doesn't have age. Like, if you wanted to add an age structured property, then here's some examples about how you would do that, or here's some things that are available to it. So now our documentation is automatic. It's embedded into that user's experience. And so as people are facing this, they don't have to break their thought, break their pattern, break their flow. It will just naturally be there and make them much more successful and have a more pleasant, calming experience. So at this point, Janet is working well. Janet has overcome our problems. She's found Stack Overflow. That's directed us to the right documentation page, or our error messages are nice, descriptive, meaningful, and overcome and solved all of the problems. So now Janet's like, you know what? This project's really working well. it's time for me to start improving places, giving back, supporting the community. And this is where we can start to do think about other things happening. So the guidelines and contributor guidelines about how we want people to be engaging with our project. So this is a great example from Mozilla, and it looks overwhelming, but it's just nice, clear headings, and they're just pointers and flags to where we want contributors to go. We want to welcome them. Hey, we're excited to have you as a new contributor. We want to embrace that. We want to make people feel welcomed, even if it's a short thank you for thinking about this. And then table of contents, so making sure that people know what's possible and like where everything is. Important things. You know, you're going to have docs. How do you file bugs? How do you message a team? Like, where is Slack? Where are bug reports going? How does the current maintainers of the project want new contributors to be involved? And then kind of breaking it down. If you want to submit a change, the other thing that we'd like you to do, we'd like you to sign a contributor licensing agreement, or we'd like you to submit a pull request in this templated format. And then kind of continue through the patterns and going through like code of conduct, which I'll get onto, recognition, and who else and where else can I help. So again, making sure that people know the key bits of information, but also having some recognition about who else is doing this. Like, contributors are amazing, so let's showcase that. Let's demonstrate that there's this huge active community which we want people to be part of, and make them feel excited about being part of that community. And so code of conduct is extremely important. There's lots of pre-baked examples that you can use and then adapt to what you want to do, but it makes it feel more welcoming. It makes it a more welcoming, safe experience, and so it's important to have. The flip side is if you don't have it, it feels very unwelcoming now. It feels like it's an explicit no code of conduct than an overlooked one. Likewise with licensing. If there's no license, that will put huge effort on people who are working for companies about how they can adapt and how they can adopt and how they can contribute their work to an open source project. And so they're easily overlooked, but probably the two most important pieces to make sure that we're including. And so there's lots of examples and starter repos that you are on GitHub, which kind of have these baselines and these boilerplates in place so that we can go to get there. And then when you're in the documentation, we have everything on GitHub, we have everything in the README and contributing guide, but also making it part of your documentation itself. So that when people are seeing mistakes, maybe something's been outdated, maybe an API changed and it has been reflected or it's been overlooked, then they know how to make that quick change. There's no barriers to entry, there's no having to jump through hoops just to find out. You want to make it as low stress as possible, and so having it right there is a great way. And the more you can make GitHub or GitLab and your source of documentation part of the documentation itself is even better. So in this case, in the top right hand corner, you see a little edit. You click that, and then you're straight into GitHub being able to edit this page. And so if you see a typo, you don't have to start to think about, okay, I need to fork a project, I need to find where it lives on GitHub, I then need to find this page and where it is in the repo. Instead, you just click one button and all of that work is done for you. So you make your change, submit the pull request, and it goes into the pipeline. And people have done this extremely well. So the Microsoft Azure documentation is a great example. We have nice, clear headings about where we want people to go. So purpose, getting started, here's some important tooling that you'll need to be successful, license, code of conduct, like clear, explicit, visible. And then when you're in the documentation itself, you have the documentation you expect, nice interactive elements to it, being able to share feedback and edit right at the top, very clear integration. And when you look at the feedback section, it's very tightly integrated into GitHub. And so at the bottom, it's showing how many of the people have had or raised issues with this page. And so we can see it's nice, well-maintained, well-managed because everything is closed. But when you go into the details, it links directly to a GitHub issue. And so there can be a conversation. You can see what else is going on, see what else other people are doing, and what problems people have had. So it makes it nice and straightforward for people to be able to share that feedback, identify problems, and reduce the barriers to being able to contribute, which means that more people are likely to contribute as a result. And then the GitHub page at the top has all of this special tags so that the documentation system knows everything it needs to do, who are the managers, who are the maintainers, who needs to be notified automatically. And when you look at this as an impact, the top open source projects, VS Code, yep, like that is pretty successful, but it's surprising to see a cloud documentation up there in the top 5. Like that's not normally where you would expect to see a documentation project to be quite so successful, and at the time above things like Angular, Ansible, Kubernetes, which is impressive. And it's the fastest growing one of the projects, of all the projects on GitHub. So by making these barriers so seamless and so transparent, you just open the contributor guidelines up to everyone. And this proves that once you open it up, everyone is willing to help and everyone is willing to support and make those changes for the greater good. So what else can we do? So we have the longer form content, which we won't get into too much. It's a slightly different problem. So things like reference API documentation where you have Swagger and you have API blueprints and you can get those automated. So that's a whole other stream. But design docs, I really like what Kubernetes have done with their enhancement proposals. So these are a place explicitly designed for that longer form design doc discussion. It's a separate place from their day-to-day contributor implementing guidelines. This is for maintainers, and it is a place for maintainers to be able to have deep, meaningful conversations on particular enhancements that the project wants to make. But they have the same process. They have structure, they have patterns, they have procedures, guidelines, etc. But now if I'm a contributor and I have this great idea about how to take it to the next stage, then things like these enhancement proposals will help everyone in the community know how to do that and how to push it to the next level successfully. And then you'll get this huge open source project as a result, hopefully. And that's the goal. We want Janet to become our new maintainer. We want them to love the project so much that they're willing to keep it going. We don't want these key person dependencies where if that one person gets bored and goes away, the whole open source project dies. We want these new maintainers to come along and fill in and grow the community and help make sure that it's maintainable for the long haul. And other things, I keep coming back to Kubernetes, but for me, it's one of the most amazing examples. So during their conference, they will have a documentation sprint open to anyone. You can go to the room just during the day, and there'll be the maintainers of the docs team there. And anyone who wants to get involved can come along and start working on documentation issues. This is a great way for people to start immersing themselves into the community. I started with things like unit testing, writing documentation, writing blog posts. And then you slowly learn more about the project. You slowly learn more about how it works because you're the one writing the documentation. So you build up a very good understanding. And then you can start making code changes. And if you can start adding in missing functionality, because you see the pain points of the community because you're working on the documentation. So you know where it can all be improved and the project can be made better. And so having this structured time where people can start to commit, get over that initial fear about making the first step to contributing really helps make it more welcoming and adaptive. They have working group meetings. So every 2 weeks or every week, they'll actually have a group call. Open to everyone, anyone can join, but they'll discuss about, okay, these are the things that are happening, these are the things which we want to be doing, these are issues that have been raised or changes that are coming, which we need to be reflective in our documentation. Now, Kubernetes is a huge project, and that's reflected in the amount of work they do, but it's something that is definitely interesting aspects that other projects can start to adapt. And then thinking larger, they have contributor summits. These dedicated summits for their maintainers to all come together and discuss about, okay, where do we want it to go? Where are the long-term plans? What do we want to do? And also just a good time to meet people in a face-to-face, real-world situation. And so these are kind of the things that all go into making documentation amazing. So what does it actually look like in reality, and like when it doesn't quite go to plan? So I saw this tweet about one of the Golang O'Reilly authors talking about OpenTelemetry and saying, well, when I search for tracing and tracing Golang, I get open tracing docs, which are not where I need to be. I want OpenTelemetry. And I was like, why? Why is that important? It's like, okay, open tracing is deprecated. That is pretty fundamental. You don't want people to be building on top of a deprecated technology when there's something new, some new open telemetry project which have preceded it. And so it's like, okay, so these are the screenshots, and he's using a dark background, which is great for presentations. But you can see his point almost, where it's like, it's all open tracing. There's no mention of open telemetry at all. And you would like, if this is what you want people to be moving to, if you want people to be supporting and backing this new specification as an open source project, you want to make sure that that's reflected in all of your messaging and all of your marketing. And so this is a great example of where like improvements can be done. And when you get into the documentation for OpenTelemetry, it's kind of the thing which I was talking about, where there's not much signposts. These are breaking it down. Doesn't really have that nice flow about, well, this is the problem you're trying to solve, and these are the steps which you'll go through. It kind of jumps between all of these different aspects, and it's not as welcoming as it potentially could be. And you go to the GitHub README to say like, okay, I want to see this example in reality. And you go into the example which it gets linked to. There's no README, there's no getting started guide. You're kind of left to figure it out for yourself. And it's completely understandable because everyone is ridiculously busy, and everyone has 20,000 things to do. But these are the differences between how you get people open and into a project, and where people struggle and have pain points and blockers. So what does it look like as another example? So if we look at Honeycomb, very successful, commercially backed, so they have more time, more budget, but their documentation is, I find it much more aligned with what I would need if I'm implementing observability. So nice example applications. At the bottom, it's got like the different languages. So Golang, Node, C#, etc. And then it links directly to GitHub and Glitch. So in GitHub, the example for Go, very clear README. Like not much to it. It just says this is an example. Like great, that's what I'm looking for. Good. And this is how you run it. Like exactly what I need. Like there's not much more in order to be able to help getting started. When you link to Glitch, it's very similar to a Katacoda-like experience. You have a Golang environment set up. You have everything you need. You have the source code. So within a couple of seconds, I have that example ready and waiting. The other button which I have is this open in Gitpod. Gitpod is amazing. Free platform. You can link to it, and you click that button, and it'll take you into a web-based IDE with Golang set up. You'll be able to run the command and instantly have that application ready and available. No worrying about what version of Golang do I need, how do I clone that repo, what's going to be left around on my laptop afterwards, which I don't want, what else is it doing. You can just do all of this directly in the browser in a very safe, quick way. And so while Honeycomb did this for their open source, there's no reason why OpenTelemetry couldn't do the same thing. And this is where, as a community, we can have a huge impact on open source projects, because we can add that pull request, add that README, link to Gitpod, and give people that exact same experience and help encourage the documentation, help encourage the community, and help make everyone's world a slightly better place. So what are the 3 key points of the art of documentation? So we need to be reflective of developers. Developers like to experiment. We all like to poke around, see what's happening under the covers. This is what Honeycomb embraced. They're like, just go to Gitpod and start running the application. And that is how we want people to be seeing and experiencing our product. And our documentation should support and embrace this. We want to lean into that mentality of like, yes, let people just play. And then we'll get them excited and see the value. We also need to know that users are going to get into trouble. It's a reality, it's an inevitability that something is going to go wrong. They're not going to understand, they're going to miss something, or something's going to break. So where are they going to likely get stuck? And how can we catch them to make sure that that doesn't happen for too long? We don't want them to spend days hitting their head against a wall where it's just, we could have a troubleshooting page of the most common errors that they could search through and find what they're looking for. And then everyone has a story to tell. We want to encourage these contributions. We want to encourage people who may see a typo to be able to click that link and just fix it. No stress, no barriers, no having to worry about how to fork a repo, how to set things up locally. Just make it very seamless. And then as you saw from the Azure documentation, people will embrace that and everything will get better. And then we have contributors and we have maintainers for documentation, and that will make everything go along. And what is the most amazing documentation that is? Well, in an ideal world, it's documentation which doesn't need anything. It's very descriptive and very declarative, like Lego. Like, I know exactly where I'm heading in both of these examples. I know what the goal is, I know what the purpose is, and I know step by step how to get there. And now it starts from something very humble, very simple, like making a very small car. But those principles and those foundations go into building some amazing examples, amazing structures, amazing pieces of artwork, using those same building blocks and just continuing to encourage and grow and encourage people to experiment. And then we have a whole ecosystem around it. We help people use those foundations to become successful at what they're trying to achieve. And then that will go back. This is the Lego Ideas portal, where people will suggest new ideas, new themes. They'll become maintainers, if you were, of Lego sets and contribute new ideas and make Lego the success that it is. And that, for me, is the art of documentation. It's hard work, but the impact you can have will reflect on every single user who touches that open source project. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. NDC, the most famous, which is even included in The Simpsons. Thank you very much.